Well, we come to our final lecture on Marx today. Although I must put a disclaimer over here and say that even as we finish off with Marx's Das Kapital Volume 1, we are not going, this is not the last time we are hearing of Marx, and he will emerge again and again in the thoughts or ideas of many of the theorists that we will study during this course. So let us begin today's lecture, and largely I'm going to be talking about exploitation, the tendency of crisis inherent within capitalism, and primitive accumulation, that is Marx's answer to the question, where did the original stock of capital come from? So I've, as a title slide, I've put up a painting over here called The Emigrants, showing rural peasants leaving for the city in order to sell their labor power. Starting off with exploitation. Exploitation doesn't really begin with the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it predates it. Exploitation begins with the Agricultural Revolution, in fact. Exploitation here is understood as the appropriation of surplus by one class, and in this case we're talking about the producing class, that is the peasants, and the non-producing classes, that in the industrial era is the bourgeois or the feudal lord. It can take several forms, but the fact that one class does the hard labor and produces surplus and the other class usurps it is a process of exploitation. Exploitation is the marker of a class divided society. The agricultural revolution doesn't just produce class as a category in its course, it also produces gender. So there are two very significant categories or hierarchies that are getting produced along with the agricultural revolution, that then will play particular roles in the history of capitalism. Now, exploitation is a very strong marker of class divided society, and it is also something that is a point of antagonism between the producing classes and the non-producing classes. As long as, and there is collisions and conflicts and all of that marks this history, and as long as society is able to contain this antagonism, there is some sort of peace, or there isn't the possibility of a social change. But the moment it is unable to control, that is when a qualitative shift in the nature of that society happens. And this could be in the form of peasant revolutions or other revolutions, and the change is a qualitative one. Prior to that, it could be quantitative change, such that you receive a higher wage or a lower wage, or some amount of bargaining here and there, but there is no significant change. So exploitation then is key, and for Marx it is key because for the working class then to realize that they are the exploited class becomes a central part of the class consciousness that he is trying to awaken. You know, that realization through this work is what I would say Marx's objective is. Surplus labor is the social product which is over and above what is required for the producer to live. So if I receive a wage and let's say I receive 800 rupees in wage, that is the capitalist pays me 800 rupees a day, and out of that I produce stuff worth, let's say, 3,000 rupees in that day. Now the capitalist is only paying me the amount required to reproduce myself. That's the idea of the minimum wage, right? That what you need to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, in order for you to be able to show up for work, to replenish yourself, to reproduce yourself for next day's work. So that's the amount that the wage worker will get as a wage. But the rest of the amount of work that the wage worker has put in is the surplus value that they have created. I've tried to explain it in this small diagram over here, where if it's an 8-hour day and if I am able to make, let's say, t-shirts worth rupees 800, which is my wage, in 3 hours, then that 3 hours is my is where I am using that amount to reproduce myself, and that is what I am getting. But what I am producing is many more t-shirts. So the 5 hours worth of work that I am putting in, because I am putting in a total of 8 hours of work, then all of that is appropriated by the capitalist. That, according to Marx, is exploitation. That is the surplus value that is being produced and appropriated by the capitalist or the bourgeois, that is the owner of the means of production. Value, as we know, is identical or abstracted human labor, and that it is deposited in commodities. We spoke about this in our previous lecture. How do we measure it? How do we know how much is the value deposited in a commodity? For that, Marx gives us the notion of socially necessary labor time. Now, socially necessary labor time can be broken into 2 components, that is the necessary labor time. This is the amount of time that I need for earning as much as is required to replenish myself, and the rest, the surplus labor time, is the one that is creating the surplus value that goes to the capitalist. Now, surplus value, all of it is the accumulated product of SLT of the workers, and there are 2 possible ways in which the capitalist can increase the amount of surplus value that they appropriate. So, one Marx refers to as the absolute surplus value, and this is if the capitalist increases the amount, the working day. So, this is a finite, working day can only be 24 hours, and it actually cannot even be 24 hours because the worker does need to rest and eat and sleep and all of that. It has, you can only do it so much, but there can be several strategies to do it. There can be coercion, there can be surveillance, there can be incentivization, there can be several ways during using which the surplus value can be enhanced by increasing the prolonging the working day. The other way that the surplus value can be bolstered by the capitalist is called relative surplus value, and this is by improving and increasing productivity and bringing in enhanced technology. Now, this is more elastic because there is no end to the amount of technological innovations that one can do, and that. So, if previously I would produce 10 t-shirts in an hour, with better machines I could maybe the same labor can produce 20 t-shirts. So, there the capitalist has increased, but I would still be paid my 1 day of minimum wage, my dehadi as we call it in North India. So, using that, the capitalist has bolstered their appropriation of surplus value or the amount of value that is deposited in the commodity. Why is this important? Well, okay, before I come to why this is important, I also want to speak briefly about the 2 kinds of capital that Marx talks about. He talks about constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital is that which is embedded in the means of production. So, it is kind of fixed. For example, if I buy a large printing press or a machine to be used in my factory, then it cannot be changed on an everyday basis, right? It is kind of fixed for several years, maybe decades, before I can go ahead and purchase another one. And therefore, constant capital is more static, it is constant, it's called constant capital. Variable capital is the capital used to hire workers, it's the wage, and this is more easily changeable, more dynamic, because I can hire and fire workers, I can increase the number of workers, I can reduce the number of workers. There is a lot more flexibility in the nature of variable capital. Now also going back to my previous slide, there was one more thing that I wanted to mention, giving you an example in fact. I wanted to talk about technological innovations and how they change the possibility of extracting both absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. For example, the invention of electricity, and how before electricity we could only have a work day where you had to start working when there is enough light, so maybe 6:30 a.m. and then end work by again 6:30 p.m. depending on the season when it becomes dark. But with the invention of electricity, the capitalist can prolong the working day of that particular labor or develop a shift system, and through that appropriate more surplus value for themselves. So there are different ways, surveillance cameras increasing the efficiency of workers, are all kinds of technologies, both social and scientific and technical, that are used to enhance or bolster the surplus value. Alright, so this we now understand also constant capital and variable capital. Now he comes to, again, this I also told you that Marx in Capital Volume 1 is using logic to help us understand exploitation. And although we will go today to his chapter, the final chapter on primitive accumulation, which is much more historical, largely most of the book is focused on developing this logic of understanding how exploitation happens. So using these terms and these different constant capital, variable capital, he comes to define the rate of extraction of surplus value, or which is also the rate of exploitation, which is S prime. So what is S prime? S prime, he says, is surplus value divided by variable capital. Variable capital is the amount of wage that he's paying to the workers, and S is the surplus value that he's appropriating for himself or herself or themselves. So S by V gives us the rate of exploitation. Now what is rate of profit for the capitalist? This Marx says P prime is S, which is surplus value, divided by the big C capital. The big C capital is a sum of constant capital, the small c capital, and variable capital, the small v. And so rate of profit is equal to S divided by C, which is equal to S surplus value divided by constant capital plus variable capital together. Now anybody who, and all of us here, know the simple math, with the denominator being larger in the rate of profit, we know that surplus, the rate of exploitation or the rate of extraction of surplus value is always going to be more than the rate of profit. In all of this, Marx is also trying to get us to understand that this enhancing of, let's say, bolstering relative surplus value or increasing the rate of profit, these are not never-ending possibilities, because if you increase technology too much, then you will not be hiring labor, and technology, the constant capital, is dead labor, labor that has accumulated in that particular machine or that particular in the past. It is not current labor, it is dead labor in that sense, whereas variable capital is living labor. And we also know from our understanding of Marx that all things of value come from human labor. So if there is too much constant capital and very little labor time or labor power going into the production of a product, then the surplus value will not increase very much. So there won't be production of value happening. And therefore, there are all these contradictions within capitalism which lead to crisis. I want to take a brief moment to go into various forms of exchange where, for example, if I have a commodity, if I have some object with me and I sell it for money in order to buy another object. This is a simple kind of an exchange. It is sell in order to buy something which I need or want. and it is not generating any surplus value here. The other form of exchange could be I have some money and I trade it for some commodity which I go and buy elsewhere for a slightly higher amount of money, and in that whole process I gain some profit. This is buy in order to sell. This is what traders do, and in this case I would make some profit. Now in the capitalist process, it is you have some money or some capital and you buy a commodity or raw material. Labor power is used to enhance the value of that particular raw material or convert it into a higher priced commodity and then sold for more money. And then again, out of that more money, it is inserted into, that's another process, and you get more raw material converted into a commodity. So it is, capital, Marx tells us, is not static. It is not wealth. It is not, when Adam Smith is talking about wealth, wealth can be in I can store it, but capital is always in motion. Capital is always, you need to keep kind of putting it in circulation, then it is capital. Now, in fact, I put up this quote also from chapter 24 here. He's saying, employing surplus value as capital, reconverting it into capital is called accumulation of capital. That is how capital accumulates. That is how you accumulate capital, is by making money, re-putting it in as capital, and then more and more. And capitalism as a system requires you to accumulate. And that actually makes it very unstable. It makes it unstable because, one, I already spoke about how when there is too much technological advancement, or if I sell something quite expensive, such that, who is the consuming class here? The consumers are also wage workers. So the wage workers, I cannot decrease the wage that I pay to the workers so little that they are not able to afford the commodities that I have for sale. Similarly, I cannot increase the price of the commodities to an extent where the wage workers cannot purchase it, right? So there are all of these factors that need to be considered. Now, at some moments, since capitalism is so prone to crisis, there is an over accumulation of capital that happens. When over accumulation happens, then there is too much accumulation because of the accumulation drive of capital, and there isn't too many avenues to invest. Avenues can be closed for many reasons. There could be that I've exhausted a particular industry. There are too many other capitalists in the same industry. So then the capitalists would probably look for, let's say, moving in a different sector. So maybe from a primary sector, they would move to a secondary sector, or from a secondary sector, move to a tertiary sector, move geographically, or oftentimes, as we will learn in one of the other lectures, although Marx also talks about it, but we'll speak about this more when we speak of Harvey. But land also acts as a sink of over accumulated capital, as does warfare, right? The history of capitalism, as many have said, is a history of constant warfare. There is never a moment in the history of capitalism when in some part of the globe military has not been mobilized. So and what does a military or a intervention do is that it destroys, and that process is referred to as creative destruction. It creates the need for more capital to flow in, for more arms to be made, for destroyed buildings to be recreated or rebuilt. Therefore, again starts the circulation of capital, puts it back in motion, because capital, like I said, is only capital when it is in motion. So that is one. The other is overproduction. If there is a product that is overproduced, if there are too many commodities in the market and not enough consumers to buy those, then a crisis of overproduction happens. All of these inherent crisis tendencies in capitalism make it very prone to collapse, and this is also something that Marx is trying to tell us. All right, now we come to the final chapter, and here in this chapter Marx moves from his emphasis on theory to an emphasis on history. While theory is more abstract, it can be of every place, it can be anywhere, it doesn't quite belong to a particular country. History is more specific. And so, when he's trying to answer these historical questions, and here he's largely very interested in getting to know how does this whole process begin? Where does the initial capital come from? And these are also questions that he's asking to writings of Adam Smith. Adam Smith has written about how wealth in societies is a result of division of labor. He kind of takes the fact that there is an initial stock of capital as granted. Marx says no. How does the initial stock come from is an important question. So that where do the initial laborers that you are going to divide come from? So he's asking very historical questions. Where does the initial capital come from? What objective forces led to the transition from feudalism to capitalism? Who were the initial bourgeoisie? Who were the initial laborers? Now we move to the final section of Marx's Capital, and this section is called Primitive Accumulation. In the translation that I have, it can be original accumulation, initial accumulation, but largely here Marx is concerned with where did this all begin. He is asking of Adam Smith, who had argued that the wealth in societies is a result of the division of labor, and Adam Smith assumes the presence of an initial stock of capital. Marx says no, we must find out where that initial stock come from. He wants to know how this process began. Where did the laborer come from, the initial laborers? Who were the initial bourgeoisie? What objective forces led to the transition from feudalism to capitalism? Now these are very historical questions. So in this section, Marx moves away from two things. One, he moves away from theory to history, although he is still theorizing, but using history, not as much the kind of logic that he was using in the previous chapters. And unlike theory, which does not belong to a particular place, which is abstract, which is generalized, not of any particular country, history is very specific. Right? History is of a place. You cannot tell a history of nowhere. So in this particular case, Marx is primarily focusing on England, and he does his research. He's drawing a lot from the East India Archives in London, and I have a picture up here of the East India Archives. And an interesting aside that I think you might enjoy listening to is that while Marx was working in the East India Archives, one more scholar of the same kind of significance was working in the East India Archives, and that was Charles Darwin. Both of them interested in the question of origin and in some ways origin of a species history, right? One from a social perspective and the other from an ecological perspective. So that is the first thing Marx moves away from the domain of theory to the domain of history. The second thing he moves away from is the domain of civil society and the domain of contractual relationships that we have spoken about so far, into the domain of the state. I'll read out a quote, although I don't have it up on my slide here. This in my volume of Capital 1 is on page 185, and Marx writes, "This sphere that we are dealing with, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man, the domain of civil society. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham." I will not come to Bentham now, we'll do Bentham when we are studying Michel Foucault, but you get this sense that civil society is this domain of contractual relationships, of freedom, of notions of equality, of property, of exchange, whereas now we will come to, in this chapter, the domain of the state, of the relationship between the state and its subjects, of laws. He writes in chapter 26 on primitive accumulation, where he's trying to answer this question of where did this all comes from. And he says the expropriation of the agricultural producer, of the peasant from the soil, is the basis of the whole process. Now, the peasants were already working, they were already part of the means of production. They possessed land, even if they didn't own it, that could help them sustain themselves. They had to be dispossessed of what they had in order to move, to become free, to be able to sell their labor power. That's the process Marx says is the beginning of the capitalist mode of production. Again, I have this Richard Redgrave painting here on titled The Emigrant's Last Sight of Home, a rural peasant leaving for the urban, the town, to be able to go sell their labor power. Alright, I'm going to spend some time on this slide here. The first step Marx talks about is the dispossession of the peasant from their land, from their means of production. And this, he says, is a process that we often refer to as emancipation, in the sense that the peasant was no longer a serf, so no longer under the feudal lord, and so was free, was emancipated from the feudal lord, but at the same time was also expropriated from the land that sustained them. So while they became free, they also became unprotected and unable to themselves grow their means of reproduction. The next step, he says, was aggregation of the means of production, and this happens through a process of expropriation, which began with the Reformation and confiscation of the lands of the church. Now, churches and monasteries were large landlords, and the state comes in and starts to confiscate these lands. And on these lands were serfs who then become wage laborers or are forced to move out of those lands. Alongside, we see the abolition of feudal tenure over land. Now here, it is the domain of the bourgeoisie that is taking over the domain of the nobility or the rulers. In Britain, for example, we see the parliament becoming more powerful than the monarch, and eventually the monarch remaining a monarch only as a symbolic position. So there was that level of expropriation, and then there were large commons. There were large commons on which the landless peasants often farmed, or these were lands held in by the village as a village common. These came in to the view of the bourgeoisie, who then through enclosure acts and other measures enclosed them and converted the commons into private property. This is also a very interesting story of how, let's say, agricultural land or farmland is converted into grazing land, because the need, as the industries grew, the need for wool became great, and therefore you needed more sheep, and the sheep needed land to graze, and these enclosed private properties became grazing lands. The same thing happened at a different time in history, though, in Calcutta for jute and in Bombay for cotton, where large lands had to be enclosed and made into plantations or grazing lands, depending on what the product was. Now, the former peasant who was earlier under the feudal lord and the former artisan in the town who was under a strict guild system were both freed using successive, and Marx goes through successive parliamentary laws that came in and shows how they become freed. Now, free, he's using with a sense of irony here, because while they are free to sell their labor, they are to any particular capitalist, they are not free to not sell their labor at all, right? Because they have to also earn their means of livelihood. So they become the propertyless and the unprotected wage worker. Now, as these large amount of peasants are migrating from the rural to the town folk, not all of them are absorbable in the factory, right? So there is a large pool of surplus labor who are roaming around the streets and trying to find their space and means. Then come the laws of vagabondage, where loitering is prohibited, where vagabond is a criminal activity. And again, here Marx goes into many different cases describing quite horrific punishments for just roaming free and not going around selling yourself your labor power. So, one, you become free from the land that sustained you. Then you are forced to sell your labor power because you can't roam around freely because of these kind of the laws that come in. Alongside all of this, accumulation is happening through other processes, let's say in the colonies, through gold and silver mining in America, through plunder in India, through hunting for slaves in Africa, plantation colonies in the Caribbean, and in England also, very important point, capitalism or the capitalist mode of production doesn't begin in the factory. In fact, capitalist mode of production begins on the farm, on the agricultural land, where capitalist farmers set up large farms after having enclosed those lands and employ wage workers to work on those farms to produce not just for their own need, but also produce a surplus in order to sell in the market. Now, this also leads to accumulation of capital. There is already wealth from prior accumulations, and Adam Smith also spoke about this, wrote about this wealth in pre-capitalist Europe from merchants, bankers and noblemen, and through again different laws, through different processes where the state definitely has a role to play. They are either expropriated or many of them become the bourgeoisie themselves and put this wealth in circulation such that it is now capital. The role of the state is very important over here. Many of those with wealth were also large money lenders, and the state, which is in this case, let's say the king or the monarchs, became indebted to these money lenders. Sovereign debt acted as a major lever for primitive accumulation. So once the sovereign is in debt and is forced to pay back to the money lender, one of the ways they can do it is by raising taxes. If taxes increase, then the petty farmer or the small landholder is not able to pay those taxes and eventually either ends up losing their land or pauperizing themselves in other ways. Money lending was one of the major processes through which several small landowners were expropriated of their land, and then that land appropriated as private property. So these are several different processes through which primitive accumulation happened, or the initial stock both of capital through aggregation of expropriated land that happens, and the creation of the first pool of wage laborers that consisted of peasants that had been freed or emancipated from the feudal lord's hold. This moment in history has been written about in several different literary texts of the time. I have put up here Thomas More's Utopia, a 16th century novel. And I want to read out a small quote from here where he writes, "Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters, now, as I heard say, we become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. So these enclosed lands that had become from farmlands to grazing lands, they are displacing people, they are dispossessing people. And he's talking about that process of the Enclosure Acts, where the grazing of the sheep to raise wool, to create wool for the factories, is becoming so much more central than farming itself, and so dispossessing people. There are several others. In fact, in the Indian context, you can go back and look at the film Mother India or Do Bigha Zameen, both of whom in which you see the cycle of indebtedness and then losing one's land and then eventually moving to the city to go work as a wage worker. Fascinating histories of the times of this transition from the feudal system, where the peasant, even though they are under the serf, have at least the possession of a land in order to make their ends meet. I want to end with a quote again from Marx, and he writes, "The advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition and habit looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident law of nature." So Marx tells us that primitive accumulation does not end with the beginning of the capitalist mode of production. In fact, primitive accumulation is an ongoing process. For any capitalist enterprise to begin, it needs that initial stock, and the initial stock of both capital and labor has to continuously be replenished and renewed, and therefore primitive accumulation is an ongoing process. What he's also trying to tell us in this quote is that the story or the ideology that is part of the common sense, where the worker also tends to believe that that they go to the factory, they receive a wage, and that it is a fair system, when in fact it is a exploitative system. So what is exploitative appears as just and fair, and what is social, it's a social historical creation. This whole process of capitalist production appears as natural. I will end the class here. Thank you.